All right, so thank you for the invitation to come and present, and particularly to sort of present a little bit about how we might integrate some knowledge and understanding about teams in organisations and how we actually function in teams into our education at the university and education more broadly. So how do we take what we know is the design of work in the future, and not just the future. We know that our world is so complex, work is so complex that we can't do the things that we need to do in organisations on our own. We have to work with others, we have to work collaboratively in teams, and we have to be able to learn from each other. Because the future, and this is an area of research that I look at, is in particular in healthcare. We've been talking about the future of healthcare being multidisciplinary teams for years. And the patient safety issues that arise because we don't have multidisciplinary teams and the gaps that occur. And so we know that that is an incredibly important way that we need to work. Making it happen and making it happen effectively is extremely difficult. Sydney Children's Hospital, for example, is one of the first hospitals in New South Wales to really go down that path and create multidisciplinary teams. But just having different people in the same room to collaborate does not mean that they work together effectively. And so we need to create ways in which we work so that we can actually reap the benefit, if you like, of those different disciplinary expertise. And I think that's something we need to take into education, so that it's not just about getting better performance outcomes, and students are very focused on performance outcomes, but also about getting better learning and learning from each other. So that's kind of the background, and that's where my research and this particular topic intersect, because I want to give you and start by giving you a little bit of background on the course that I'm currently teaching and how we bring that component of research into the classroom, and the ways in which we try to work with students to both understand the context in which they'll be moving into and how they bring that context into their education, if that makes sense. So, all right, so let me just start by telling you a little bit about the course, because I think the context of the course is quite important. So the course that I'm involved in and have developed from scratch about 3 years ago as a result of a review of the Bachelor of Commerce, it's called Buzz 2000, and the title of it is Leading and Influencing in Business. It's a core course for everyone who does the Bachelor of Commerce, and it's in the second year. And as its name would suggest, it's about thinking through what is it that you're going to do to influence others when you actually transition into the workforce. So how will you take, or how will you leverage the skills, the hard skills that you have, that you learn at university, in order to influence, in order to make a difference, in order to actually succeed, both in terms of what you want from your career and in terms of what you want to achieve for the organisation you're part of. So this is very much a forward-facing or forward-focused course, looking at the future and how students actually think about the skills that they need to develop and engage with in order to be able to be successful in whatever career they choose. So it's around employment, interpersonal skills, leadership, employability, but also developing that understanding of what it takes to influence others, and what it takes across an increasingly globalized and diverse workforce. And really about being proactive in your management of your own career, and understanding what it takes to be successful in your own terms and what those terms are. So that's a lot for a so it's a big ask, but you don't get anywhere if you don't have big ambitions. And I'd like to say, actually, that we teach this as a team, which in itself is a very interesting way of working, because at the university we are so rewarded for individual performance. And so to be able to unpack that and actually put forward a case for why you want a team to work on something and why you should share the joy and share the misery is an interesting interesting sort of case study on its own, I think. Yes. Anyway, that's for another topic. So, okay, just some very brief philosophy around it. We very much wanted this course to be a sort of an action-based course involving students in actually doing things rather than just reading about them. As it's an academic course, we do want to bring the literature, we want them to engage with the research, we want them to think about theory, but also we want them to practice and actually do these things. And so, you know, we want them to feel safe in the classroom and to really explore some of these slightly more challenging ways of working together. The other context is that it's a little bit differently designed. It's actually a blended course, so we have modules online and they do very interactive workshops. That's the word I was trying to get to, workshops. So they're an hour and a half in the workshop each week, and we have face-to-face, we call them meetings because they're not really lectures, but they do, and I should frame this in the context that we have almost 2,000 students that enroll in the Bachelor of Commerce each year. So we're talking about huge numbers. So when I talk about face-to-face lectures, it doesn't look like this. We're in the biggest lecture halls that there are. So yeah, so most of the work is done in workshops, and for this to work we need students to be really engaged and to have prepared and done all the work before they come, so that we can just work through lots of little activities, exercises, and engage around discussion. All right, and this just very briefly, we have 3 themes: understanding yourself, which is culminates in a career plan; understanding others; and leading and influencing, which are all directed towards a team project. And it's the team project part that I want to talk about, how we integrate. Okay, so the way that we present this to our students is that we're giving them a project which is broken into 2 components. There's a component which is a pitch to investors, and this is actually, we designed this alongside with the Wayside Chapel and New South Wales Treasury. They have a request for proposal. You can put forward an idea to improve youth unemployment. A challenge very close to our students' heart and something many of them feel they're facing. So the idea is that they need to come up with an innovative business proposal, an idea, a concept for one way that they could make a difference, and actually build it around this proposal that New South Wales Treasury has for new and innovative ideas. And it's a way that they're thinking about how they can actually start to shift the landscape, rather than these big blanket programs across the whole state. So we ask students to develop a business proposal in teams, and then they pitch it. And they pitch it Shark Tank style to the audience within their class. And they need to have done their research. They need to actually build a fairly strong business case around this project. Now that's the task. We try to make it as authentic as possible for our business students, but that's the kind of thing they need to be doing, and that's where all the focus is. But then we follow it up with a report, and that's where we say, okay, the task work, do a quick executive summary. Okay, done, finish, park. Now think, what have you been doing? What have you been doing as a team to actually make this happen? And how can you unpack that, thinking through the lens of the literature and the evidence, to think about what you as a team have done together? And how does that help you think about how do you work together in the future? And how will you work with others in the future? So actually separating out the task and the teamwork components and getting them to start thinking and processing around the principles and practices of working effectively in teams. All right, so what sort of literature do we introduce them? How am I going? Plenty of time? Seriously, I could speak for Australia, so I always worry about time. So look, most of our students it doesn't matter whether they're finance major, business analytics or whatever, most students will have some familiarity with at least one theory of team development. And most of the time it's this relatively early theory. It's a bit like saying, who knows about motivation? And then you say, what do you know? Maslow. It's kind of like, it's just what they say. So you say, what do you know about teams? Oh, Tuckman and Jensen's team development theory. So they know about this theory. And you know, it has a place. It helps them think through perhaps some process that they might go through. Certainly it's typical in the sense that it's about short-term project teams, so it matches the kind of work that they do together. They come together, they do a bit of storming around how they might work, they're norming, developing norms, performing, and then going on their way and never having to meet again. Most of them very relievedly say. Our students don't love teamwork, I have to say. So we do revisit that, and then we start introducing them to perhaps some more complex models around how they might think about and frame the way that they work together. And we introduce them to, for example, Gersich's model around transitions and transitions in the way that teams work. And again, this resonates quite well with students because it suggests that, you know, the first meeting of a team, you get together, really the effort activity is pretty much non-existent until about halfway through when they panic and think, oh crap. And then there's a lot of work that they get together and do, and then it's sort of nothing happens, and then there's a little burst and nothing happens. So introducing them to the idea that teamwork is not something that happens continuously, it's something that happens in bursts. And fairly typically, halfway through is when they will start to engage, not at the beginning. And how they might think about that in terms of the way that they want to plan to work together and when they want to plan their work. Another theory that we spend quite a lot of time on is this theory, well, it's sort of a model. It's the input process output model of team working, and the way in which you need to think about what are the inputs into your team. And that's everything from who are the team members. So what are you bringing to the table? How can we understand each other and what our strengths are and what we actually can contribute to this particular project? And then thinking about the team context. So what are the characteristics of the task that we're required to do? What is it going to require of us, and how will we work together? So it's the composition of the team, the task characteristics, and then the context. So within the academic context, you know, there are many levels that we're asking them to think about. They're thinking about the academic outcome as well as the learning outcome. And so there are sort of all of these things they need to be taking into account. And then from there, that to recognize that as the inputs into a team are important, so are the way in which you use those inputs, so the processes you develop. And to really think about the processes as being both positive forces that can enable the team to function effectively, but also negative forces that actually can undermine the way the team works. And to be thinking about those two different types of processes and how they might impact the way that the team functions. So norms and roles, how you're going to communicate, what ways you're going to communicate, the coordination costs. We all know that they want to do the assessment on their own because they figure it's just too hard to get together. It's too hard to wrangle the person who won't do the job. It's too emotionally draining to have to keep engaging with other team members that just don't seem to want to be involved, or don't care about them, or quite happy to let them teammates carry them. So it's when you ask students to work in a team, you're asking them to do much more than just do a task. You're asking them actually to influence and to be influenced, to be leaders and to be followers, and to be effective at all those things. So it's quite a complex thing we're asking them to do, and we often throw them into that context without really much guidance. We just kind of design the task and then say, okay, work out how you work together and where you work together and how you influence each other and manage all these often challenging situations without much thought or without much guidance around how. So here we do try to talk to them about how do you build cohesion, how do you build a sense of a common purpose, and we try to scaffold things so that they actually engage in it. So part of the report, they'll have an appendix where they have a logbook, and they're supposed to chart what they do and when they do it, put in photographs, put in other bits of evidence that they met for a coffee or they went out for dinner or whatever it is that they did, went partying, it doesn't matter. Do something that actually builds your cohesion and gives the team a sense of context and togetherness. We also spend quite a lot of time around conflict management, because again, this is where often the rubber hits the road for students. They're not really sure how to engage with conflict, and they find it difficult to manage their emotions and their experiences in the team when conflict arises. And yet we know that when they get into the workplace, conflict is one of the key things they have to manage. And if they can practice and gain some experience with different strategies while they're at university, they will be able to take that forward and be able to practice that more and develop their skills. Quite frankly, it's a skill that perhaps we work on until we retire and then deal with conflict at home, but it's sort of it's an ongoing lifelong learning skill. And then we also talk about outcomes, because what is the outcome of this? So for many of them, the only thing they're thinking about is the performance of the team, and the performance is judged by a mark. So they're very much singularly focused on a mark. But we want them to think about, well, what else could performance be? What else is an outcome? And explore things like, well, how much fun was it? Did you actually learn anything from each other? Did you make friends? Was it something that you'd want to do again with that group of people? So think about these, think about outcomes more broadly. That's an uphill battle, quite frankly, because they're very driven, and students were all driven by the KPI that is rewarded. And the KPI that's rewarded for them is an HDD credit. That's what they're looking for. So that's a tougher sell, but nevertheless important. So then we introduce the idea that there's different types of conflict, and that they can think about conflict in different ways, and think also about how conflict works in the work. And this comes from some of the work by Tom O'Neill and his colleague, who do a lot of work around conflict and the way that we can think about conflict in teams. And Tom O'Neill has done a lot of work, particularly he's done work in organisations but also in student teams. And in fact this research, this paper, was built around some research he did with engineering teams, which looked at conflict profiles. So his research was particularly interested in how different conflict types might influence outcomes. So in this case he looked at task conflict. And this is where you have differences about what you're doing. So if you're planning a innovative business proposal to solve youth unemployment, then arguing about what would be the best idea, what would be the region we'd focus on, what metrics would we use, how will we measure success, all of those things. So engaging in conflict around that is around task conflict. Process conflict, how will we get this done? Where will we meet? What are the rules about when we meet? And about, how we actually do this task. Is it going to be a Google Doc? Is it going to be through sort of getting together around a whiteboard? How are we going to actually do it? And then the relationship or affective conflict, sometimes interpersonal conflict, which is around actually where you're just having conflict with others because it's interpersonal. I actually don't like your idea, in fact I don't like you, that kind of conflict. So he found that there were 4 dominant types of conflict profile, and a profile or a latent profile analysis in our literature is where you look at clusters. So he found there were 4 clusters of teams, and that these teams were represented by these graphs. So of these 4, which would you say had the best outcome? So we've got 1, 2, 3, or 4. So who would vote for 1? Yeah? What was that, Lena?
I would say in the middle somewhere.
The middle somewhere? Any other thoughts? 1? Yeah? Okay. So what he found was that the teams that had 1 as their profile actually got the highest grades. So those teams that had high levels of task conflict, so they engaged with each other in open dialogue, they collaborated, they debated ideas, but they didn't get involved in too much interpersonal or process conflict. Those things they resolved quite quickly, or they came to consensus around. The ones that got the lowest grades were in fact the cluster where there was quite high relationship and process conflict, and that actually dampened down the task conflict. So people weren't willing to engage in that battle of ideas because of the spillover to these other types of conflict. So the runner-up was the could be worse, and then the really rather ineffective. So we use that to talk to students and teams about how to actually progress through this. So we actually use an online platform where we actually ask students to complete these surveys themselves about their teams. So they do this at 2 time points. They do it just when they do a practice pitch, so really early on in the way that they're engaging together. So how does their relationships look now? And we ask them to, so if I can just explain this, so what we ask them is about, okay, so what is your task conflict? And what you can see there is that the orange bar is the average for all teams in Buzz 2000. So every team that's done this course has is part of this conflict profile. They're all pretty high on average with task conflict. This team is the pink triangle. So this one here, so their team conflict is pretty low. And the red and the black dot represent the 2 individuals within the team. I caught this a bit early. We really needed more people to have finished it. Usually they're teams of 5. So you'd normally have 5 dots there. But you can see they cluster quite closely, not surprisingly, around the average because it's capturing those 2 that have completed this at this point. So they look quite different from the average. And we can see that the average for the conflict profile is in fact high task conflict and then low process and relationship conflict across all the teams. But you can also see that this team actually looks quite different. Yeah, their average process conflict is pretty high and their relationship conflict is pretty high. So they're not tracking too well. So this is an opportunity for them to start thinking about this, and then they complete this again in the end of, towards the end of the process, and then they include it in an appendix, and that's something that they can unpack. What are some challenges we faced? What did we do about it? How did we manage it? We also include a measure of team humility. So how willing have they been to be vulnerable in the team, to admit that they're wrong, to admit they don't know everything, that kind of thing. And then also how well they think the team is doing. So what they think their performance is like. So we sort of use the literature and introduce these ideas and then get them to do it so that they can see what they're tracking and how they're tracking, and then get them to think about how they can improve. And then we get them to reflect on questions like, so drawing on that input process output model, how would you describe your team? What have been the inputs? What processes have you used? And what have the outcomes been broader than just your performance? What challenge have you experienced? How have you managed that challenge? And what would you do collectively differently if you were to be in this situation again? And then finally, we build the criteria. So this is their presentation criteria, but very much even in the presentation, are they a coherent team? Do they present a coherent message? And then the team report is all around how do they apply these theories to themselves and reflect on the process. So application of theory, reflection of their challenges, and reflection on their learning as a team. That was a bit of a gallop. But I think that's probably all I've got for you.
Thank you very much. I like to do these things so that they're a little bit more give and takey than talky. So there will be a couple of opportunities for you to maybe lean across to someone next to you or behind you and have a short discussion. I just find that helps me gather my thoughts, and it has some learning benefit too. So I'm here to present.
You'll be able to have that online as well in the chat, of course.
Yeah, time for reflection. They might take some individual notes. And if you want to read, if there's text responses, I'd be happy for you to throw some of those at me too, Lena, if that's cool. Okay, so I'm here. It's a pretty sexy sounding title, I think, which I kind of cribbed from Nikola Tesla. So there's sort of a little bit of history at work here, a little bit of the development of education, and a lot about the future. I'm not really a gambler, but it is good to think about where things may be heading. So I'm Tony Cannell, I work at the business school. My main role there is to support academic language and learning for postgraduate students, but I also teach into the Masters of Management program and a course that's called The Future of Business. So that's a rather appropriate background to this particular presentation. The first question I have for you is, what the hell do you think I'm going to talk to you about today? Any ideas?
Internet of Things.
The Internet of Things, okay, yep. Do we know what the Internet of Things refers to?
Devices that talk to each other?
Devices that are integrated, so your phone will talk to your fridge will talk to your garage door will talk to your car. More and more interconnectivity, I guess, of devices, and by proxy people, users of those devices are going to be more interconnected in their ways of living and their ways of working as well, ways of being. Any other ideas of what I'm going to talk to you about?
Reflecting thoughts, so you can see it physically. Is it best something goes in your bio, I think?
Okay, all right. I might be able to sneak some of that in, yeah.
There was some articles about that recently.
Okay, good, excellent, yep. I have that bias too, that recency bias, where you see something and it just becomes part of the next conversation you have with someone. I am going to kind of cover augmented reality as a technology in particular, but I'll also sort of go over my thoughts on the differences between mixed reality, augmented reality, and virtual reality. So hopefully there's some interest there. If I start hearing yawns, yeah, I'll move on. So this was the kind of jumping off point for me. I found this quote by Nikola Tesla. He was asked to make some predictions. There was all the way back in 1915, on the cusp of a rather large world event. They were asked to make predictions about the future. And one of his predictions was, in the not too distant future, we'll be able to flash any image formed by our thoughts anywhere. We'll be able to render it on a screen, make it visible in any place that we desire. So how correct do you think he was if you just look at the context of let's say, education, teaching and learning today? In a classroom, are you able to do that today? You can reflect a thought as an image, and it can be projected on a surface or a screen, and the learners can engage with that. Have you done that in a teaching and learning context before? Have you visualized a thought, projected it, and asked students to reflect on it? Sorry?
You have to type something or like interact with the computer.
Okay.
It doesn't go straight out of your brain.
Ah, so that we're not quite at that magic stage where you can sort of ideate, you can have an idea, and it's just kind of projected visually. Wow, that would be a scary future, I think, because now we're talking about mind reading and reading other minds. I think his last point there, that his idea was if we can get to that point where whatever's in here we can visualize and we can share with others, that we're going to head towards some sort of social nirvana, some sort of beautiful situation where we all perfectly understand each other. Do you think that's on the near horizon? I like the laughter, that was good. For the people at home, that helps. So my research area is augmented reality, which is essentially a way of overlaying the real world with digital images, could be video, text, animations, and usually the interface for augmented reality would be a handheld device, or it may be a small headset. So the HoloLens is the kind of famous augmented reality. Virtual reality is that truly immersive experience where you have a full headset on, you're usually tethered to a reasonably powerful computer, and what's happening is it's generating an entire virtual environment. So augmented reality is kind of on the spectrum down towards closer to the real world. You're still in the real world, but you're engaging with digital content. Okay, virtual, you're fully immersed in a digital world. I'm not as interested in virtual reality as I am augmented reality, but I'm happy to tell you why later. The term I like, I hate VR, AR, XR. They're kind of marketing terms. It takes a long time to explain what they mean. And really, the catch-all that we should be using is something closer to spatial computing. So spatial computing, very simple concept. It's using computing power, processing technology to engage with real physical environments or to generate totally virtual environments. So for me, spatial computing really captures the whole field of digital worlds all the way down to just visualizing text on a surface. Cool, I think I covered that. Yeah, I think VR and AR and XR are sort of used like buzzwords, and in business we see buzzwords come and go biannually. My least favourite one I wrote down was synergy. So usually a word, I saw someone looking at is it Gartner's hype cycle? Someone was looking at the hype cycle before. It's the same with buzzwords in business. So the word synergy, everyone starts using it and they're like, what a fantastic term. Then it starts getting ridiculed, and then it kind of dips down and it's derided, and it dates your thinking and it makes you look old-fashioned. So I think VR, AR, that distinction is probably going to end up going the way of synergy. Space versus language. This is kind of philosophically what I find very interesting. So we have in the Western tradition heavy influence on the role of language in creating the world or understanding the world. And a lot of debate's been about whether the world informs our ideas or whether our ideas label and create our worlds. This is kind of goes all the way back to Plato and all the way up to Wittgenstein, Bertrand Russell. Basically logic debates about language and its role in the world, in world making. It's also a heavy part of linguistics. So the eminent Michael Halliday, who passed away, I think last year, from the linguistics department here, he was a key contributor to the field of systemic functional linguistics. It was all about the power of language and its influence on identity, on the world, power relationships. It's also a big part of behavioural psychology as well, but it's kind of given language this very privileged position where a lot of people see language as the kind of measure of what it takes to understand the world and be in the world. And I think it is a very, very important part. But what we're getting now is more and more information coming through neurology, neuroimaging. They've located centres of the brain that are specifically designed to deal with space. In evolutionary psychology, we understand that space and spatial awareness probably predated any use of language by a long time. And also, if you look at the brain itself, about half of our cortex is devoted to things like pattern recognition, spatial awareness, and your facility to remember a face is incredibly impressive. So it could be years can go by since you've seen a certain face, and you'll see that face and you'll recognize that face. You might not remember the name or even the context that you met the person in, but our ability to remember faces and spatial areas, zones, incredibly impressive. In 2012, O'Keefe and Mr. and Mrs. Moser won the Nobel Prize. They worked on looking at rodent brains. They located what they call place cells and grid cells. So they've also come up with this concept called the inner GPS. So it looks like human beings, the way our cognition works is that a lot of our thought processes are dependent on our sense of space, location, rather than just being generated through a language per se. So there is a movement at the moment towards looking, I guess, at space as being a sort of foundation of thought. So there is a shift happening there that I'm very interested in, particularly because I have a linguistics background. Okay, business and spatial computing. The first representations of systems, the first alternative visualizations, the first flight simulators, they were sort of coming online in the 1920s. But it wasn't until the 1960s that people started using, or the computing power got good enough to be able to represent more complex systems. And today in education, systems thinking, design thinking, and getting students to understand that we can now assess and analyse and interact with these emergent properties from very complex systems, that's sort of driving a lot of pedagogy these days. I know Lena's done a lot of work in that area, a lot of research. So back in the 1960s at MIT, a game was developed called the Beer Game. And I think it's significant for understanding the role that business has in this trajectory, because it's basically based on a supply and distribution chain for the process of manufacturing and producing and distributing beer. Different students role play different elements of that system. We could call it a complex system, although it looks quite simplistic. But students behave in particular ways given their identity in that system. But what happens is these strange and wacky emergent properties, some of them which are quite negative, they emerge from ordinary behavior within a complex system. So it's quite a powerful piece in terms of understanding complexity. It was a formative sort of thing. The strange thing is it hasn't moved much further beyond the 2D visualization on a computer screen that it was in 1960. So representing complex systems in augmented reality is something I'm interested in, because it's just, we're not quite there yet, but we're getting there rapidly. Tensions. There's a tension between research and the serious study of pedagogy and education and learning technologies and business. So in business, I found this great quote: pilot project planning should be fast and cheap, and that should be the mantra for anyone working in spatial computing for business. So they want to do fast, rapid, quick turnarounds, very fast evaluations. Does it work, does it not? Chuck it out, use it. And that sort of drives a lot of business. We can contrast that, actually with the yellow box is better. When we're in a disciplinary context, research tends to take a long time, and we take it rather seriously. And there's a peer review process, and you have to pass ethics. Okay, so you're almost forced to slow down. You can't really rush through the research and publication process. It's just not possible. So there's already a tension between the way business is treating these technologies and the way that we're treating them in our context here. Again, business loves to tell you how much the market is going to be worth. And when you read that, 5.2 billion projected by 2020 to be 162 billion, oh, fantastic, I want in. Okay, that isn't such an imperative for research per se. So there's again a tension there. This is really cool because it's from a very recent study, and I'm glad there seems to be a nightclub or something behind us bleeding through the wall. Yeah, it's augmenting my reality. Education institutions, and this is an Australian think piece that was published. Dan Tehan, I think it is, the Minister of Education, he was the driver behind this. Education institutions should support innovation and a transfer of research and development to local employers. So for me, that's taking a very narrow view of the role of the work in which educational institutions have, particularly in spatial computing. If the only thing we're meant to do is train and skill people for local jobs, I think we're missing a more global or a more outward-looking piece. So there's a lot of tension happening in this field. Now, your job. With the person sitting next to you, all you need to do is choose one of these little snippets. You can either love it or hate it, because some of them are interesting and some of them are aggravating. Pick one of those quotes and have a short discussion about it. And I'd like to survey you when you're done. I'll give you have we got 2 minutes? Sure. I'll give you 2 minutes. I'm at about 15 minutes. Yep.
But we're actually quite loose.
Oh, okay. Be careful, yeah.
So don't feel stressed to rush it.
Sure.
Still core this technology to be the actual design to and then you have to have the program that's not
Okay, we might just wind it up there if that's okay. Thanks. Great to hear you engaged and working together and people offering their own thoughts and ideas. Excellent. If you could identify the box you mainly discuss by colour, and we might start right here in the middle if that's okay. So which of those little boxes do you...
I'll pick the red one.
Yep.
And I think it's a little bit too simplicity.
Excellent. In what way? What's the thing that grates on you in that little quote?
I still call it the augmented reality or virtual reality should be treated as more like I'll call it a vehicle to drive the whole, I guess, learning outcome rather than just see it as just one tool or one technology. Because I think we need to couple with learning plans or activities or even, I guess, a social interaction to actually create that knowledge as opposed to just go, there you go, it will make you smarter.
Yeah, excellent. This idea of just boosting education, I'm not even sure what that means. Yeah, to boost education. Also, yeah, it's a single tool. So if you can get it done with a pencil and a piece of paper and it's more effective, efficient, and it contributes to learning, do it that way. It still takes a lot to invest in using augmented reality in the classroom. We ran a pilot, which I'll talk about in just a moment, but yeah, it took a lot of energy and effort, even though the technology is catching up, the usability is coming down or getting easier. Yep. Anya's group, which colour?
We chose yellow.
Okay. Why did you choose that? It's quite an interesting...
She chose it because she likes yellow.
I like yellow.
Good. It's a good enough reason.
And I guess it just seems to be more an expansive way of thinking about it than a very limiting way of thinking about it. So that's always good for educators and researchers and designers, right? To have more things to think about than less means that, yeah, you've got more kind of options, really.
It moves away from viewing it as some sort of product. So often when people think of VR, they think of Oculus Rift, Oculus Go. They think of particular marketed products made by these big tech companies, and it kind of robs us of a bit of our autonomy, I think, as educators. We're not just consumers of off-the-shelf products. We should be a lot more critical than that and more engaged with the development of these technologies. Excellent. And the final group.
Shall we talk about the black box, the top right there?
Yep.
It's a very generic statement, but we kind of got excited about what sort of environments and applications
Excellent.
are, currently existing and where it could go in the future and all that sort of jazz. So we're talking about things like Ola mentioned in one of our discussions recently, the idea of walking into a blank room and being able to, see a museum, like a science museum or a history museum, or just that sort of kind of directions where we were discussing.
You've kind of anticipated my next slide, but that's fantastic. Yeah, again, this idea of uniqueness. Is that the metric that we're going to apply to educational interventions or new products? Is it, you know, its level of uniqueness? It doesn't mean a lot to me as an educator, to be honest. Business education. So we're becoming very used to seeing these type of complex 2D flat representations of things like complex systems. This is a representation of a software architecture. So it's been visualized. It's meant to have a sense of ease to it, or to make something that would otherwise be totally unrecognizable have some sort of form. But I don't think it does as an efficient job as perhaps these researchers. What they did was they took the metaphor of an island and they took the same data and visualized it in augmented reality on that tabletop there. And different formations represent different elements of that software configuration or different parts of the program. They can also move and change different elements of that, and it's all linked to that original data set. So visualizing something like that for learners, to me, is really, really exciting, because the systems that we're meant to be interacting with, engaging with, and that we're giving birth to through AI and machine learning, they're going to require us to be a bit smarter about how we visualize that much data and that complexity of data. This is, again, a 3D visualization of what sound looks like bouncing around a room. So it would actually be almost meaningless to flatten that in 2D. It needs to be visualized in 3D. And again, for business, things like transport and logistics. You can take students down to a highway and get them to look at traffic flow, or you can give them sort of a God mode where they can look down, they can manipulate different elements, they can really get a kind of really strong global sense of what's happening in a system. So for business education, fantastic. Actually for any education, really. We ran a pilot study, about 60 students. We had a project-based task, a short task, and it was all delivered through an AR platform called Zappar, rather cheaply and effectively. 88% of the students we worked with had not used AR in an educational context before, but 11% of them reported that they had used some form of AR, probably Pokemon Go. Some of the quotes are fantastic. I'm trying to wrap up now because I'm conscious I've gone over 20 minutes. The one that I liked was, I prefer the face-to-face method. I found that interesting because I was the instructor and I was in the room with the students. I was monitoring discreetly, but I was there. So there was something about their interaction with the AR technology through their mobile devices that sort of gave them this sense that I was gone. And I found that fascinating, really interesting. We got them to fill out a bit of a heat map as well and said, where could you see yourself using AR? And I was also interested to see that they seem to lean more towards collaborative settings than private or individual settings for the use of that technology. So I found that particularly interesting, that there seems to be a bit of an appetite for using the technology in collaboration with others. My last idea, if I didn't go way over time, would have been for us to pick maybe one of those business areas. These are different disciplines within our business school here. Maybe to pick one of those areas and think about how an immersive technology or the 3D visualization of data through AR, how that might transform or bring some sort of learning benefit to one of those particular areas. Probably don't have time to do that. Unless you want to pick it up in the Q&A a bit later. Yeah, cool. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So what we'll do next is we'll just open it up to questions. It can be to either presenter about either presentation, or you feel free to ask questions that relate to both if you see a crossover or interesting themes.
May I ask everyone to speak as loud as you can, that everyone was able to hear, because the microphone is over there. Thank you. Sorry.
I have a question for both of you. So for Anya, How do you scaffold or guide the students to focus more on how do you scaffold the students to focus more on task conflict more than relationship conflict and other kinds of conflict? Or do you actually have to do that, or do you let them realize that you should focus too much on these other kinds of conflict? Do you start with that, or you just like something like productive failure, you let them make mistakes first?
It's a really nice question, actually, and I think there's a few different ways to do it. We do let them have the experience first, so that they can then have an opportunity to reflect, because it's difficult to reflect on something you haven't done. So it's almost like an action experiment, in the sense that you want them to engage with something without necessarily having scaffolded it for them, and then scaffold it so that they can think through what's been going on, and then provide them with some of the tools. So one of the things we do is that, having flagged that it's not that conflict's bad. I think that's the overarching message. We don't want students to think, oh, we can't have any conflict, because if we have conflict, that means that then engages all these other issues, and it means that we're not going to be able to work together, and so on and so forth. So we want to kind of disentangle what conflict is and how it can be used. Because when they go to the workplace, they will have to engage in conflict. And they will, if they want to make these multidisciplinary teams, if they want to make diverse teams work, they're going to have to work out how to and what to engage in conflict about and what not. So it's sort of a process. So one of the workshops that strategies we use is to go through a brainstorming technique. So how do you bring ideas to the table, and then how do you actually enable everyone to have an open discussion about those ideas, and to then work together on which idea you want to follow. So we give them a scaffolded process to do that. So that's kind of how you do the task conflict. And then we talk about, well, what are the ways in which people manage conflict when it's not about the task, when it's more interpersonal. And we know that the interpersonal stuff is the worst. That has the most undermining effect. So what do you do? How do you actually manage situations where there is interpersonal conflict? How do you try to reduce the likelihood that will happen? So using language, I think, is a really important one. So rather than I hate that idea, which kind of translates to I hate you, say in people's minds, it's kind of like, wow, that sounds like an interesting idea. Have you thought about what might happen if this, and this? Or that looks like a really interesting idea. How would we make that happen in reality? So actually get people to come back to the idea rather than engaging in more personal kind of processes. I mean, another very typical one sorry, I said I could talk for Australia. Another very typical one that we do, I mean, there's a lot of literature around being a devil's advocate and having that as a role within your team. So rather than say, okay, I think your idea sucks, let's each take it in turns to be the person who says, really? I don't think that's a great idea. Then it's not personal. Then I'm playing a role, and that's my job in this team. It's not because I think your idea sucks. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of disentangling the personal from the context and the contest of ideas.
And I have another question, but for Tony. Should I?
It's okay, just if you could shout your voice a little. Yeah, thank you.
So how about authenticity? Have you encountered studies about having less than authentic experiences using augmented reality, where what they're trying to study didn't translate well because the environment that they were studying in, for example AR, isn't as real as the real world. So it comes out as a misconception.
I think as soon as you visualize something in the current way that AR works, it's not going to look as real as the real object itself. Studies I've encountered have looked at the authenticity or a gap between the real. I'm sure there are studies. I could probably find some for you. None spring to mind. But it's not really what we're going for. We're not trying to create a real visualization of something. I would just bring it in and use Realia if I wanted to do that. But yeah, think of it more as it's an object that could be inscribed. So I could give you a Coke can and say, okay, write on that Coke can, but you would really struggle to do that. That Coke can visualised in 3D, even in 2D, you'd be able to manipulate that object and actually inscribe things on it. So for a marketing student, that kind of interaction with a product, it gives you actually affordances that the real object can't give you. So I think of the affordances more than the limitations. I try to, yeah.
It's more for like modeling, like the ones that you show.
Yep.
Really for like real environment.
Yeah. They're things that you couldn't do with real world objects. Yeah. But that use of metaphors is really powerful as well. I've seen metaphors of solar systems used to explain different levels of complexity or to visualize data. Cityscapes, things that we have an intuitive understanding of how they kind of function. They're great methods for understanding complexity rather than looking at code. Yeah.
I'm thinking of, for example, the traffic example you gave. Well, you can't actually get students to stop and start traffic lights and kind of look at the way that impacts on traffic flow and that kind of complexity of traffic. But you could in a 3D. And so, as you say, it affords you the opportunity to do something you couldn't do in real life rather than replicate real life.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question for Anya. So I read a paper from back in 2003 that talked about open plan offices being a bit of a conflict trigger. And based on what you were saying, I suspect those interpersonal skills that you're giving your students will come down to whether that's a positive thing or a negative thing. But I was just wondering, based on your research understanding, do you think now that this is becoming more prevalent that the space and how that relates to conflict is an issue, or do you think that issue is becoming a thing of the past?
It's a really interesting question. And I think it's a very relevant one because you're absolutely right. When we think about education and what we're preparing our students for, we're preparing them for a world that looks very different to the world that we remember and that we still have the privilege of, sort of, at university, though we're moving away from it, which is our own personal space and places to concentrate. So I think it's really interesting, and but I also think that is not what we're talking about in terms of open plan. Hotdesking is also changing very quickly. So it's not that, and I know that, well, I don't actually know that paper, but I know those two researchers because they're up at UQ. And interestingly, they were talking about, so the open plan, it's sort of the typical open plan environment. But now organisations, I think, we hope that they're starting to think again. It's sort of what you were saying about technology. What does it afford, or what affordances does it give us? What opportunities to work differently? Why? For what purpose do we want to create these spaces? Because if it's to allow for collaboration and to allow people to actually engage with each other in a meaningful way, then we need to think very carefully about how those spaces are arranged and not just set up a bunch of desks with a bunch of screens and tell people to find themselves a hot desk. It doesn't work. That creates conflict because I don't get to work with somebody I need to work with today. I have to find the bit at the end where I don't know anyone. Somebody who farts a lot, I don't know, whatever. But you know what I mean. It's just, so I can understand what you mean in that sense. But I think where we're starting, and part of the problem is also how do people perceive why that's happening. So a lot of it's to do with real estate and saving. Because maybe they need the offices to do it.
I have read studies where, like, really interesting things, like if they ask someone to move to a different space, they get a bit upset. But if they're able to bring their pot plant with them, they seem to be a bit more compliant or less upset. So it can even be just objects that you have at a workstation that give you meaning, identity, comfort. So not even the space necessarily, but the objects in that space can be really significant too.
I'd like to read a question from one of the students online.
Excellent.
Okay. So Amy asks, Anya, is this process changing students' perceptions of teamwork?
Oh, I'd love to say it was.
just say it.
I think for some, yes. I think for some, it's been helpful for them to think more deeply about why and not just the doing. About why they're doing it and why we require it at universities, and why universities' education has moved from 100% exam at the end of a semester to actually a whole bunch of things that require you to engage in education in completely different ways. You need to use emotional intelligence. You need to be able to present your ideas in a public setting and so on and so forth. So I think it's a more rounded way of thinking about learning, and I think it also is helpful for those students where they actually are able to learn more effectively that way. So look, I would not say that we have 100% converts at all, and we still have challenging situations where it's just too hard and somebody takes over the work and does it. So, and then you lose the benefit. But I like to think that sometimes we don't necessarily just want short-term learning, but actually we want to plant seeds that become generative over time. So that's my best hope.
Thank you. Anyone else from the crowd?
Daniel, how do you think that would translate to the business world where there are other variables in play, if you like? There's issues to do with hierarchy or concern for hanging on to their job, or all those sorts of things that they would think about in that kind of context, but as students they don't have to think about.
You're absolutely right. I mean, status, power, hierarchy, leadership style, because if we're asking, if people are going to work effectively, and I'm thinking, for example, my research on multidisciplinary teams, these are made up of different health professionals, and trust me, there's a strong hierarchy there. So there may not be formal status or formal leadership roles, but where you have medical doctors, allied health professionals, nursing professionals working together, then the leadership plays a really important role in enabling everyone to have a voice, because people look to those more senior roles to see, well, what is being endorsed or not endorsed? Do people dismiss an idea because of the source, or do people engage with it in a respectful and reflective way? So you're right. I think the student experience is very different to the real world experience. But one of the things one project we were doing with those multidisciplinary teams was actually around thinking through processes. Whose voice is being endorsed? For example, if someone speaks out, is it being endorsed by the more senior people? Do they say, that sounds like a really interesting idea, I'd really like us to explore that further? Or is it kind of like, did she say something? It's interesting. There's some really interesting research that is actually on how this. So this was some research done by a colleague actually at the University of Western Australia, and he was looking at surgical teams. And what he found was that the most junior person on the surgical team, typically the most junior nurse, in the teams where they had a voice, where people listened to them, they actually had the fewest errors and had the best clinical indicators. So that was kind of like a representation or a proxy for how people treated each other in the team.
Or a bottom-up process rather than a top-down.
Yes. But the fact that they had a voice, as opposed to other teams where that person never spoke, actually had implications for how that team ran. So you're right, we can't replicate that.
Different environments.
It is, and for different purpose. But it's interesting.
I had another question for you, because our student research team was looking into the future of universities and disaggregated courses where people, micro-credentials, people just pull off the module that takes their fancy off the shelf and other ones from other courses to meet their needs for skills for a job they're particularly looking for example. So is that potentially a threat for the kind of university experience you're trying to give your students? In that if they, for example, their social skills might not be very good, so they might avoid teamwork kind of modules and prefer to go to something else, pick something else. So they're missing out completely on that experience. And that's leading into their choice, basically, when really the course you put together, you'll be prescriptive because we know this is going to be useful in going on. So how interested in your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's a challenge around, so I mentioned that this was designed based on a review of the Bachelor of Commerce, where we realised that some students were navigating that degree without any contact with people skills. And yeah, that was possible. And so we created a core course. That brings other challenges. Some of the students come kicking and screaming. And it does force them to engage with it. And I don't know that they all appreciate, like those who have the grounding of those skills, they really embrace it. And I can see their enjoyment in having the opportunity to practice. Those who do not want to be there, it's a real struggle to engage them and to bring them with you. We have lots of sticks and carrots, and we manage to keep them through the process, but I don't know, it's interesting, at the very end we get them to develop their LinkedIn profile, okay, so if that's an important thing, that it's a tool they'll need as they go into the workplace, and we've got business students, so it's a really important tool. And then we connect with lots of them, which is lovely. And then a year or two later you'll get these little messages saying, oh, I just had this situation and I remember what we talked about in class, and so it's then that it occurs to them that this might be useful. So I do think that's a real threat, because if you can just pick and choose, then why would you choose the hard things? Or why would you choose the things that you don't really care about, but nevertheless are going to be really important for you to be successful?
It's really setting up for success.
And it also, it assumes that our students know what is best for them, which sounds very paternalistic, and I don't mean it to sound like that, but to some extent, for our, just graduating or just recently come from high school, I'm not sure they've got the perspective yet. I don't know.
I think we bear some of that blame as well, because our unit of study outlines are they don't particularly capture or they're not the right format to get across some of the nuance, some of the depth. They're pretty procedural and they're just box ticking activities really for us. So yeah, we should do a better job of informing the customer so that they can make a good decision. Did Peter talk about, you were at Peter's presentation, did he talk about stratification? Stratified learning zones? Was it Peter Reimagining? Totally different Reimagining. Yeah. Did he talk about stratified learning zones? No? That's something you should read up about, particularly in that, looking at disaggregating influences in education.
Thanks.
So the thing that made us successful as a species is that we cooperate and we offload difficult tasks to the member of the group who's best at it. That got us to where we are, but it's also the weakness in learning that students will say, well, you're better at quant than I am, so you do the math stuff and I'll do the presentation side of things. So it's a strength, but it's also a weakness in terms of comprehensive learning.
If I could, I'll ask a question from somebody online. So Aaron asks, Tony, should AR designers, programmers only rely on educational experts when designing educational AR applications, or should they also learn pedagogical approaches?
Sorry, what's the class of people that are making the decision? Who are the people here?
Designers, programmers.
Did I read that wrong?
Read again.
Okay, I'll ask that again. Should AR designers and programmers only rely on educational experts when designing educational AR applications? Or should they also learn pedagogical approaches?
I think I know what the question's getting at.
Yeah.
Because we do see a lot of products that are marketed as educational, but you scratch the surface and there's little validity, there's no research behind it, there is no conceptual framework or established pedagogy. So I would suggest that anyone that's developing an app or an AR solution for education, yeah, you should probably at least consult with an education designer or an expert in the field, or at least read up on your pedagogy or do a degree. Yeah, I think that would be prudent. Yeah, you'd probably sell more units ultimately.
I think what he was asking was, in your opinion, would it be work with somebody that knows that, or try to cross that boundary and learn some of it himself?
Yeah, it's weird. Usually my relationships go the other way. So I'm talking to coders, trying to explain principles of education, and they're like, all right, yeah, I think I've got it. So yeah, it's about collaboration, isn't it? It's about, and that interdisciplinary piece.
You can't. The world is too complex.
Yeah.
I don't think we can cover it all anymore. And I think that's why the team story is so important, because we're on a hiding to nothing really if we try to do that.
Can I ask you a question? Are you going to tell a question for me?
It's about augmented reality or virtual reality.
Spatial computing.
Spatial computing. For those spatial computing program that's targeted for learning education.
Yeah.
Tony, in your experience, do you find that those programs are really useful in generating knowledge or actually create a learning outcome, or they are being seen as more of a distraction because of the new technology being put onto the learner level, I guess, as opposed to learn from the progress more of, wow, this is so cool. We all get distracted and actually never learned anything.
The historic parallel was probably the first time an overhead projector was switched on in a classroom, right? So I'm sure there was a period of time where students went, what is that? And how is it working? And maybe they went and tried to break it or threw rocks at it or something out of fear. But, people get comfortable. I don't like the term digital native. I dislike that as a descriptor or as but the reality is we do have students that are very capable of working in 3D. The students that we're getting through the business school come from very diverse backgrounds. So yeah, there's usually someone in the room that knows what you're talking about or can explain it to another student.
So I guess you're also asking, do the bells and whistles actually overpower the learning?
They can.
They can, yeah.
They can overpower the instructor too. Like I've seen people pitch a product to people, let's say academics on a higher level than I am, and those academics just went, let's buy it. And I've just been listening to the pitch going, all right, okay, they're making a lot of promises, but where's the substance? Where's the evidence? Where's the data? The interesting thing about AR is there are some bespoke products that will take you from design through to implementation. But to be honest, a lot of the work you do in AR relies on existing platforms like Unity. You build a lot on game engines. So there's a lot of kind of bricolage, or what would you call it? You've got to be a bit resourceful when you're working in AR, and I like that because you're kind of learning across different platforms and you're not just taking something off the Microsoft shelf and implementing it. You can do that if it works. Yeah, why not? But, thank you. Good.
I have so many questions myself, but I better give the people online their voice. Okay, so Ong Prang asks, Anya, one of the course's aims is to build a career regardless of disciplinary specialization. How do you see the potential to apply this idea in personalized education, where students get to design their own degrees?
You can design your own degree?
I think that's a bit like your question, actually.
Yeah,
I'm sort of thinking about,
Doubling up. Nice.
yeah. I'm sort of trying to think about what I would say differently, in the sense that if you're building a personalised degree, I mean, maybe a way to do it would be to give students choices but have buckets that they need to choose from.
Or have technology that AI or something that leads them to choose the right modules depending on what the outcome is they're looking for.
So that's an interesting idea. So maybe some that's an interesting idea. So maybe some self-assessment around where are my strengths now? What do I think I want to gain from this degree? But where would I acknowledge that I perhaps need more of? And maybe even doing that like a bit of a 360. Don't just rely on my perception. You know, maybe ask a few people, you know, a couple of my mates, maybe my parents, maybe a partner, who knows, I don't know, maybe a boss that you work with, or a colleague. So get a sense of where my strengths are, and then maybe that then creates a little bit of a menu, you know, some things we would recommend that maybe you might want to think about. So I can see that as being a potential in the sort of pick and mix type of sort of platform. You know, if you're going to be able to pick what you want to do, to actually use some sort of informed way that isn't just based on personal preference and what I think. That might be a foundation.
Revealed preferences and choice architecture.
Yeah.
So that can be a powerful piece as well. So if you, rather than saying you did that unit, and that unit, if it's actually no, you accrued that skill, you did that less well, and that was visualized, maybe that would give someone a better evidence base than, I don't like math, I'll do that subject, or my friend's in that subject. So yeah, data visual. We've been talking about visualizing on the test statements, like when you graduate. We've been talking about doing that for years. I'm not sure if it's coming online anytime soon. But yeah, that choice architecture can be quite powerful, because you think one thing about the world and then the data reveals something very different, and it just makes you think a bit deeper or be a bit more critical about your choices. That's the happy side of AI and big data.
Yeah, I was reading a paper recently about the ecological university, the university of the future. It won't just be about research and about authenticity. Universities will worry about learners, about people, and about the planet, and society at large. And he's suggesting that the universities will have to give more grounded education that meets the needs of business as well as the actual individual's world. So they go out there into the real world, and so if you take that, if universities do take that responsibility that someone should have a more rounded education, then if you let them just choose things that match the skills of the job advert that they've been reading, then maybe they'll be failed by universities.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really good point and a really interesting one, because that's something I have been particularly challenged with, is that I don't believe the purpose of doing a unit like the one we have, or education more broadly, is to train you up so that you're suitable for a job. I don't believe that's the purpose, and I think that's why we try to frame it around you being proactive in terms of your own career choices, rather than you being suitable or properly employable to fit a particular niche that an organisation is looking for, or recruiters that are looking for. So I think there's, you know, and that's why I think it's part of a bigger conversation about actually what do I want to do, and what is important to me, and do I want to be in one of those top 4 consulting companies, or, you know, which so many of our students aspire to really think about those things.
The big 4.
The big 4.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is it's interesting to see undergrads, postgrads that I work with, all the way up to sort of an EMBA, like MBA, experienced business people. And it doesn't matter where you are on that journey, there's still that sense of learning who you are, knowing that classic thing about knowing yourself. And I think that's what education really, I mean, that's what it did for me, right? That's what I took away from it. It wasn't just a gig or a job. It was a bit deeper than that. Yeah.
If I could ask. So, Anya, your innovation in the business school is human-centered and trying to implement more of these people-to-people relationships. And yours, arguably, is more technology-centered and then working with how people can interact within those affordances. For both of you, if you could each answer, what are some of the barriers to further implementation, scaling, that you see, and what do you think needs to happen to address those?
Interesting. I think because it is human to human, it will never be something that can be purely online. So I think for some people it was a bit counterintuitive that we would teach leading and influencing in a blended format, which means that every week students have modular online on Canvas material. They go into things, they do personality questionnaires, they test their EI, and they do all of these things, but they have to bring it to the classroom. So the challenge is that we always need to have a space where people can workshop together, because you lose, I think, the value if you move away from that small group learning experience where it's safe to practice. And so creating a safe space for students to push themselves a bit beyond their comfort zone and to engage with each other and to see each other as partners in learning, I think is essential. And so if there's a push towards more online, more technology, then I think we lose that. And so I think we never want to lose sight of the importance and value of being able to engage with each other. And really, my role in that classroom is simply to facilitate that experience.
John, your opinions?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm interested in technology-centered learning. It's mediated, but all learning is mediated by some form of technology. If you take a broader definition, so language is a technology. If your mother's teaching you that first word, she's using a technology. So I do take it very broad, but it's the same in business. It takes a while to get students to understand a broader idea of what a stakeholder is. So they think it's clients, it's someone in the supply chain, but no, it can be the river next to your factory. That's a stakeholder. So taking that just broader view helps me a lot. But yeah, it's as soon as you say virtual reality, people just go, ooh, geek, nerd, technical, coding, scary. But no, it's a tool for a job. The pencil's a tool for a job. Language is a tool for a job. They're all technologies.
I see some wonderful potential for language support in these spaces, and also, like you said, annotating within the space. But how can you, what do you think about scaling that? Like, what are some of the things that will make it difficult to make this more widespread?
I think for me, scale is connected to that idea of working in groups. So no, not everyone in your workshop can have a headset, an Oculus headset, and maybe they could if you had a lot of money and resources. For me, it's about putting 3D objects in a student's hand so that they can ideate, or it can stimulate some sort of discussion that otherwise would happen differently if mediated by a piece of paper and a pencil or a whiteboard. So the technology's kind of, it looks like the bells and whistles, but it's really about just thinking about very small effects on the way that people come up with, form new ideas or work collaboratively, and trying to solve that interdisciplinary puzzle that we're all trying to solve, which is how can we get biologists, how can we get business people, how can we get policy people, how can we get academics together in a room to solve climate change? How do we do that? How best to mediate that so that it's successful?
I have one more question from online, if you guys are okay with that. So Aaron asks, Tony, do you see instructional design branching into augmented reality? If so, how should tertiary institutions adjust their training to cater for this specialization?
I think it already has. Michael Jacobson here has been working in digital worlds. Someone before mentioned productive failure as a concept as well. So bringing together these pedagogies, practices, methodologies, and then just running them through the filter of whatever intervention, whatever technology you're thinking about using. What was the question about the future? Was there a bit at the end about the future?
How should tertiary institutions adjust their training to cater for this specialization?
They need to take on more risk, because some of the technology looks clunky. Things like occlusion, where if someone puts a hand in front of the camera lens, the object disappears. We're not at a very polished, slick, easily deliverable area in terms of VR, AR, or spatial computing. Doesn't mean we're not going to get there. So I think institutions can't be too risk averse. They need to invest. They need to kind of understand. The unit I teach into in the management course here is all about understanding future worlds, and that it's not a single linear line. There are all these different possibilities, and we can use the technology to go in all kinds of different directions, but that involves levels of uncertainty and taking on risk.
And I'd just like to add to that as well. I showed you the graph where we have students and the averages, and so that they can see their own experience and also whether their experience is shared by other members of the team. Now that's a platform that's been developed by a colleague in engineering, and he's taken a huge risk. And we've worked with him about how we visualize this data and because it allows students to read a paper about conflict and then click on a link and go in and answer questions that are in that paper where participants in that research did that. And then it generates this information for them and they bring that to the classroom. That's all about connecting at scale. And Peter Bryant talks a lot about this, because you need to, if you're going to have classes of 1,000, how do you get all of them to connect together in a way that allows you to still provide them with an interesting experience and for them to reflect, but still bring it back to the person. And just taking risks. He's had enormous challenges trying to get funding to make this stable, to make it integrated, and so on and so forth. But we've got to trust that some of these new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things, some of them may fail and some of them will succeed, and we just need to be able to invest in those things so that we can take risks. Because otherwise we all go, too hard, just go back to the lecture. It's, much simpler.
Yeah, and the other thing is my job is not to deliver the end product. My job is just to, like any researcher, just contribute to that body of knowledge in some small, hopefully meaningful way. And that's what these institutions have been built upon. So there is also a traditional piece there as well. It's not so new.
Yeah, it's true.
We just got to walk the walk. Yeah.
Well, sorry, I was just going to ask, do you think that investment that you're talking about can really only come in these new private universities that are coming about? And if that's the case, isn't there a danger because isn't there a catch somewhere as well because they have their own ideas about what they want out of that venture?
I think that's scary, actually. I think our big public institutions like Sydney University are vital. I think they're part of what makes Australia different from the US and other countries. We don't have to rely on benefactors and those kinds of things. So yeah, that's a scary prospect. I hope not.
I don't like industry partnerships as long as they're meaningful and they're negotiated equitably and they're not exploitative. I don't see why we can't partner. I deliberately flag that kind of tension that often exists between the way business wants to implement or drop a project before it becomes of some cost for them. So yeah, if we can kind of get on the same page. I'm not averse to partnering with external partners. They can set up their own university. They have. And they've also got the money to say, we want the best philosopher we can find to teach this course to our employees. Lucky for them. Great. Hopefully the best philosopher in the world's interested in helping children in urban areas to learn philosophy, or something that is a bit more socially valuable, or create some sort of shared value, if they're a really good philosopher.
On behalf of everyone, I really appreciate both of you coming and speaking tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.